It's not only the US that will suffer more frequent and intense wildfires. It's going to be a major problem for Australia, Russia, South Africa, and the parts of Europe that will be more vulnerable to drought and heat waves. In a 2-degree warmer world, the Sahara will effectively be moving northward.
That's associated with an extension of something called the Hadley cell, which is where air rises on the equator, where the heating from the sun's strongest, and moves outwards and descends over regions like, currently regions like the Sahara Desert. In descending, it dries the air, and you end up with no rain, and you end up with a desert. Under global warming, this cell becomes fatter, and it tends to descend further north in the Northern Hemisphere, and that's basically taken in the Mediterranean region.
Every year, millions of tourists flock to Mediterranean beaches. However, this will stop as temperatures continue to rise. Places which are now temptingly warm will become parched, barren and unbearably hot. Local economies will suffer as tourism declines. For other regions, this rise in temperature and desertification will become a matter of life or death.
A 2-degree increase in temperature can lead to water stress in several parts of the world. By 2020, in Africa alone, there'll be between 75 to 250 million people who would be affected by water stress as a result of climate change.
If we're to avoid the effects of a 2-degree hotter world, individual efforts to reduce emissions by conserving energy at home and at work will need to become second nature.
The most important single thing that human society can do to reduce its impacts on the global climate is increasing the efficiency with which we use energy. More efficient cars, more efficient airplanes, more efficient air conditioners, more efficient light bulbs, more efficient appliances, more efficient manufacturing processes. There is tremendous potential.
In the United Arab Emirates, work has started on a project to take energy efficiency to the next level, the eco-city of Masdar. It'll be completed by 2016, a vision of the future. 50,000 people will live and work here. The city will be powered by clean technologies, so it will be carbon neutral. There will be no cars in Masdar. Instead, its residents will get around in driverless pods. It may look like science fiction, but all the technologies planned here have already been developed. Masdar will bring them together and give us an early glimpse of how we may live in the future. One futuristic clean technology is already in use in Shanghai, China. This train has no engine at all, and no engine means potentially no greenhouse gas emissions. This is the first high-speed commercial maglev train in the world. It travels at 431 kilometers an hour. So the 30-kilometer journey from Shanghai airport to the city takes less than 8 minutes. Maglev is short for magnetic levitation. This train literally floats on air. Fan Mo is a director at the Chinese Maglev Research and Development Center.
Magnets fixed in the underside of the train force it into the air. Gravity tries to pull it back down. Together, these two forces keep the train levitating.
Once it's off the ground, another magnetic field in the track pulls the train along and slows it down.
The train has reduced friction, which means its efficiency is improved and it travels faster.
Maglev isn't a cheap technology because of the cost of laying the guide rail. Old train tracks would have to be replaced, but the benefits could be huge. The fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions is air transportation. Maglevs could offer an alternative to short-haul flights, which would completely change the face of travel across Europe, Asia and North America. But that won't happen right away. The Shanghai Maglev is quick and efficient, but not totally emissions-free. That's because the magnetic force that drives the train is powered by electricity, and here in Shanghai, that electricity is mainly generated by coal. So for this brilliant technology to really have an impact, we need either to perfect carbon capture and storage or come up with an alternative way of producing electricity. One country in the world has already done this by harnessing nature. 99.9% of Iceland's electricity is produced with no greenhouse gas emissions. Iceland's fortunate because it sits right on top of a geological cauldron. At the Blue Lagoon Health Spa near the capital Reykjavik, people are bathing in the same geothermal water that's used to generate their electricity. This health spa was traditionally filled with wastewater from the Svartsengi geothermal power station, which produces no greenhouse gases. Here, superheated water from deep underground emerges as steam, which drives electricity turbines. Geothermal power is readily available in places like Iceland, where there's a lot of volcanic activity. They've broken their dependence on fossil fuels for electricity. But not for cars. Iceland has more cars per person than almost any other country in the world. But it's pioneering a new technology that may make gas guzzlers a thing of the past.
This car looks like any other car. It's a typical look of a gasoline car or any car. But this is a hydrogen vehicle, which has a fuel cell technology.
Fuel cell technology is being pioneered by John Bjorn Skulason's company, which operate 13 prototype hydrogen cars. Under the hood, a fuel cell splits the hydrogen into protons and electrons, its basic subatomic components. The electrons travel through a circuit and are converted to electric power, driving the engine. In Iceland, they believe fuel cells are a big improvement on the conventional batteries that power existing electric cars.
The advantage of a hydrogen vehicle is we can refuel a hydrogen car in 3 to 4 minutes, and we'll have a similar range in a hydrogen vehicle as we have in gasoline. So the difference with battery cars is that they usually take 5 to 8 hours to refuel, and they have only half of the range of a hydrogen vehicle.
Reykjavik has its own hydrogen filling station. Here, hydrogen fuel is made by a machine called an electrolyzer. The basic raw material is water.
The unit is connected to water and electricity. The electrolyzer splits the water into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is evaporated into the atmosphere. Then we purify the hydrogen. The hydrogen goes into a compressor because the hydrogen has a much larger volume. So to have enough energy in a vehicle, we have to compress the hydrogen.
Once compressed, hydrogen can be pumped directly into the car, and the only emission is the liquid that went into the electrolyzer in the first place.
Just pure water. Excellent.
Hydrogen fuel is an exciting development, not least because you don't need to dig or drill for it. However, there are considerable hurdles to overcome. Currently, hydrogen fuel requires a lot of electricity to produce. So there's no net gain unless, as here in Iceland, the energy used to make it is emission-free. Iceland plans to be the first completely fossil fuel-free nation on Earth by 2050. But for other countries who don't lie on top of an endless supply of renewable energy, there's another source that's readily available to be harnessed: the sun. Now in southern Spain, in the province of Granada, a breakthrough in green energy. A solar plant that works even when the sun doesn't shine. When it's finished, Andersol will cover 2 square kilometres and provide power for 50,000 homes. It's a huge step forward because a coal plant of similar output would emit 180,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. The plant's 210,000 mirrors are curved to focus on these tubes. The oil inside will get hot enough to drive steam turbines, creating electricity. The secret ingredient in Andersol is inside these tanks: molten salt. Salt conducts and stores heat extremely well. Excess heat generated during the day is absorbed by the salt. At night, this stored heat generates steam to keep the turbines running. In the future, this kind of technology could really take off. Huge solar plants could be installed across dry, sunny expanses of North Africa, Texas, and the desert states. Vast areas, currently unsuitable for agriculture, could become ideal for power generation. Spain isn't the only country making huge strides in clean energy technologies. The UK is harnessing wind power by building the world's largest wind farm. With 271 turbines, the London array will generate enough power for 750,000 homes. The world's first ocean wave farm has been launched in Portugal. The Palamas uses the snake-like movements of its jointed sections to generate electricity, eventually enough for as many as 15,000 homes. In Thuru, near Malai in India, human excrement is being used to power the town's streetlights. Other Indian cities are considering it. In China, the Three Gorges Dam is the world's largest hydroelectric plant. It's designed to produce as much as 22 large coal-fired power stations. Though not a true renewable, and despite its controversial reputation, nuclear power is undergoing a resurgence. It currently provides France with 70% of its electricity, and several governments are planning a new generation of plants. All these technologies are a step in the right direction, but there's another source of greenhouse gases that's not yet been tackled. A source that produces even more than the transportation sector: livestock. The worldwide livestock industry is responsible for a staggering share of greenhouse gas emissions, 18%. That's more than what's spewed out by planes, ships and cars combined. That's because meat and dairy production need more and more land cleared for grazing, and a huge amount of energy is required to produce the animal's feed and refrigerate and transport the meat. The animals themselves are the source of one particularly harmful gas: methane. A mature lactating cow emits 105 gallons of methane a day. As a greenhouse gas, methane has more than 20 times the heat-trapping effect of carbon dioxide, so it's crucial to curb it. In a special airtight chamber, Christopher Reynolds from Britain's Reading University studies the animal's emissions in scientific detail.
The methane that's produced is a product of the fermentation of the cow's feed by microorganisms, methane-producing microbes in her stomach. And those microbes help to digest the feed that the cow consumes, but one of the byproducts is methane.
Contrary to popular belief, only 5% of methane is from a cow's rear end. The other 95% comes out of its mouth and nose. Reducing this source of greenhouse gas would be a major breakthrough.
One of the holy grails of people working in this area is to try to find a so-called green antibiotic, a plant bioactive compound that has antimicrobial action. In other words, it specifically targets the bugs that produce methane.
A methane-inhibiting treatment is only a partial solution. A much better way to reduce methane gases would be for everyone to give up meat. But as that's unlikely to happen, other ways to reduce livestock emissions are being developed. At the University of Western Australia in Perth, a strange creation is slowly growing in a lab. Oren Katz works in the Biological Sciences department. He's making some of the world's first artificial meat.
When we grow those cells, we actually tend to refer to them, we coin the term semi-living, because they're not fully alive, they're not an animal, but they are a living part of an animal sustained in an artificial environment.
This artificial meat was grown from the muscle cells of a lamb, but they could have been cells from any animal. They were cultured in a nutrient solution made up of blood plasma derived from cattle. The muscle cell cultures are grown in a microgravity bioreactor, which constantly rotates the meat so it grows in 3 dimensions. Without this motion, the meat would be flat, only a few cells thick. Oren is currently looking at ways of giving the meat more texture in order to mimic the real thing.
There is research which is being taken place at the moment in trying to find ways in which you can exercise those muscle cells so they would align and have a more of a muscle-like texture. And there's 2 ways that can be done. One is by electrically stimulating those cells, or the second way is to try and exercise them physically, trying to build tiny exercise machines, tiny gyms for those cells to grow and become more like muscle.
Oren has brought his unique piece of engineered meat to the UK, to one of the world's great chefs. With 3 Michelin stars, Heston Blumenthal is famous for fusing science and gastronomy. This meat is so cutting edge that in Britain it's not recognised as food and so can't legally be eaten.
It's got a smell of raw liver to it.
I never really sniffed it, but...
I'm not allowed to eat it, so that's about as close as I can get. You're going to turn it into the world's most expensive, tiniest hamburger.
Yes, which it is at the moment, and that's as big as one can get at this stage.
Many people may find the notion of lab-grown meat less than appetising, but not this master chef.
I think as a catalyst for conversation, debate and thought, it's fantastic because how many people are quite happy to eat sliced ham that actually is not ham at all, it's processed meat from animals that have been literally chained to the floor.
Yeah.
That's not a problem, but something that's been grown
in a
lab actually is a problem. And to me, that has the potential to be a lot more ethical.
This technology is still in its infancy. Even when scientists figure out how to increase production, this lab-grown substance would only work as ground or mincemeat. Engineered steaks and chicken breasts are only in the dream stage. And none of it is economically viable to produce yet. Artificial meat may be decades away, but there is another revolutionary technology that also mimics nature, which could be ready in a few years. And it could actually reduce existing levels of carbon dioxide, vital in a 2-degree warmer world. It's an idea inspired by the world's forests. Trees absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They play a critical role in controlling the planet's climate. So wouldn't large-scale reforestation offset global warming? It could, but there's a problem. We're running out of land. Forests are actually being chopped down or burned and turned into agricultural land at a rate of 356 square kilometres per day. But science may just have come up with an alternative.
What we call artificial trees are technologies for doing what trees do in respect to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Namely, they pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it in a form that will stay out of the atmosphere so that you don't get the warming effect of the CO2.
While renewable energies and technologies like carbon capture and storage focus on stopping the further release of CO2, artificial trees could actually reduce the amount that's already in the air. Two men may have just made a breakthrough in this scientific quest. Theoretical physicist Klaus Lackner and engineer Alan Wright. They first met here at Biosphere 2 in Arizona. Biosphere 2 was the largest completely airtight artificial ecosystem ever built. The perfect place to study how changes in carbon dioxide would affect the planet. When Alan and Klaus began working on how to make a viable synthetic tree, they knew it would be a massive step in the fight against rising CO2 levels and global warming. The first device they built used sodium hydroxide, a chemical known for its ability to absorb carbon dioxide, but they immediately ran into problems.
The sodium hydroxide solution is a very nasty material to work with. It's very corrosive and caustic. As a potential technology candidate, it just didn't work.
So they went back to work and built this.
The breakthrough on the second device was that we abandoned liquid sodium hydroxide solutions as the way of collecting the carbon dioxide. Instead, we found a plastic which was able to collect the carbon dioxide directly when it's dry. It would pick up the CO2 just as fast as the sodium hydroxide.
This magic plastic has long been manufactured for its use in water softeners, but nobody had thought to use it for its natural ability to absorb carbon dioxide. The new prototype, more like a tall cabinet than a tree, was hung with sheets of the plastic. But for the plastic to be reusable, which is to say economically viable, they needed to find a way to make it give up the captured CO2. Another chemical, sodium carbonate, had properties that could wash the CO2 out of the plastic. But then the CO2 had to be extracted from the sodium carbonate solution, a process that required a lot of electricity.
If you were to use the electrochemical device as the way of recovering the CO2, and you would use a coal plant to make the electricity you use, you just barely break even with this device. So it was counterproductive to push into this direction. Frustrated, Klaus and Alan decided to take a different approach to see if they could simplify the process. They went back to basics, using nothing more complicated than an airtight bell jar hooked up to a carbon dioxide monitor. Inside, strands of the special plastic. What you see in this bell jar is a little chimney where we blow air through, and on top of it is this plastic material. So this is what is sitting on top of this little tower, and we are observing how it absorbs the CO2.
As they knew it would, the plastic immediately started absorbing carbon dioxide, reducing the amount in the bell jar. Then they did something they'd never previously considered. They dunked the plastic not in a chemical solution, but in plain water.
So I put this back on the little tower. We lock down the bell so the air cannot escape from there.
What happened next was extraordinary. The plastic released the absorbed CO2. Carbon dioxide levels inside the resealed bell jar started to rise from 388 parts per million, the level in today's air, to 540, 730, and finally 1,100 parts per million.
We realized that this material, this plastic you see here, actually absorbs the CO2 when it's dry and releases it again when it's wet. So what it really takes is just water. You don't have to wash it with sodium carbonate. You can simply expose it to water.
It's one of those moments of discovery that once you understand what's going on and you realize the implications of the discovery, it's an astounding moment.
Having ensured that rainfall will not release the CO2, Alan and Klaus are building a full-scale artificial tree. When finished, it will have a central drum containing panels of the special plastic and a humidity control system. By altering the moisture levels, the artificial tree will first absorb and then release the CO2 for permanent storage. The process requires no chemicals, only a small amount of energy and a water supply.
The vision of the future for these kind of artificial trees is that they can capture the carbon dioxide nobody else can capture. That's their advantage, that is their strength.
A single tree will absorb about 1 ton of carbon dioxide a day, about 75 cars worth. 60 million of them could potentially absorb all the CO2 we currently emit. And that's not all.
This is one of the few options available to actually go back and reduce the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere from the level we are already at or will be in 50 years from now, back down to where it is safe.
All this absorbed carbon dioxide would of course need to be put somewhere. But that's where other new technologies come in, like the geological storage of CO2 that's being tested in Utah. And because carbon dioxide levels are the same everywhere around the planet, forests of artificial trees can be planted right on top of the storage sites. Scientific breakthroughs like artificial trees and advances in renewable energy could help halt man-made climate change, even reverse it. But if measures like these are not adopted and our emissions continue to rise, climate scientists warn that this century we could reach 3 degrees above the pre-industrial average. With this level of warming, the planet could undergo a series of tipping points, changes so significant that the climate could then spiral out of control.
3 degrees Celsius global warming would mean we're talking about a different planet. It's a planet that hasn't existed for millions of years. There were no humans on the planet when it was 3 degrees warmer. Not only sea level would be different, but climate zones would be shifted. It would be a very different planet.
The last time the planet warmed this much was 55 million years ago. And it went on to rise by 6 degrees. But it warmed at a much slower rate than is occurring now. The effects were catastrophic and included widespread extinctions in the oceans. It took our planet 100,000 years to recover. A rise of 3 degrees is a nightmare scenario for us all. Professor Peter Cox is an associate of Britain's Hadley Centre, one of the world's leading climate modelling groups. Here, underground, there are banks of supercomputers that predict weather, both in the present day and well into the future.
As we push beyond 3 degrees, we're pushing the climate system further and further away from where it normally exists. But there are indications from the past climate record and from what we know about the system that the climate system can change rather abruptly.
One climate system that could change abruptly in a 3-degree hotter world is the one that brings rain to areas near the equator, like the Amazon rainforest.
As you warm up the system, you get a pattern of ocean temperatures in the tropics that essentially draws the rain down away from Amazonia. It extends the dry season, and what seems to happen in Amazonia is when the dry season gets beyond about 4 months, fire takes control, so the moist tropical forest turns into a savanna.
Once fire takes hold in a rainforest, it creates conditions that make repeated burns inevitable. And there's a cascading effect. At least 10 years' worth of carbon emissions are stored in the Amazon rainforest, much of which would be belched back into the air. Climate modellers have identified a vast swathe of the eastern Amazon that is vulnerable to potential mega fire. There's no doubt that rainforest loss on this scale would have a major impact on the planet's climate, even beyond the massive amount of CO2 that would be released.
The loss of the Amazon would obviously be an absolute catastrophe for the people that live there and would wipe out one of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. But it also has consequences beyond that region for the whole globe. And that's because the Amazon is part of the engine that drives the atmospheric circulation through the tropics.
Global weather patterns could be dramatically altered with an unpredictable impact on rainfall across the northern hemisphere. In some parts of the world, this shift could even cut off seasonal rain. And with a 3 degrees Celsius rise, the Amazon rainforest isn't the only ecosystem that would be lost. So would what's called the permafrost zone, which stretched from Alaska through Siberia and northern Europe. Permafrost is soil that's mostly been frozen since the last ice age. Trapped within it are layer upon layer of organic matter that never fully decomposed. The permafrost is already beginning to thaw, allowing microbes to break down its ancient carbon and release it as a greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. Estimates suggest that as much as 1,500 billion tonnes of carbon is trapped in the permafrost zone, the equivalent of 150 years of emissions at current rates. Even worse, there's an unknown amount of methane locked in the permafrost, the greenhouse gas more than 20 times as dangerous as CO2.
You could imagine, in the worst case, a kind of runaway feedback in which we put some greenhouse gases in the air from burning fossil fuels mainly, we warm up the system, we melt the permafrost, and this other carbon comes out and adds to the problem. So we've got a kind of time bomb sitting there of greenhouse gases.
The sheer volume of greenhouse gases that could be released from the permafrost would likely push average temperatures even higher than 3 degrees Celsius. And in Greenland and the Antarctic, there's another time bomb: the ice sheets. Unlike Arctic sea ice sheets form mainly on land. The vast Greenland ice sheet alone contains 2,850 trillion tonnes of water. At the moment, that water is locked up in ice that's 3 kilometres deep in places. But even with current levels of warming, the ice sheets are starting to become unstable and move.
If they begin to melt and the ice begins to move more rapidly, we could get a large discharge to the ocean and substantial sea level rise measured in meters. There have been many times in the past when ice sheets did begin to disintegrate that sea level went up at rates of several meters per century. And most of those natural cases, the forcing that drove those changes was much smaller than the human-made forcing that's driving the current changes.
If global warming exceeds 3 degrees Celsius and the Greenland ice sheet melts, scientists predict a 7-meter sea level rise. This is what would happen to the coastlines of North America, Europe, and Asia. The melting of the ice sheets is another climatic event that would create a feedback loop. Like megafires in the Amazon, it would actually cause warming to accelerate. And this goes back to the albedo effect. If the reflective light surface of the ice disappears, all that solar heat is absorbed, and the Earth's climate gets even hotter. Could our cities be used to reverse that? What if we painted our world white to replace the cooling effect of the polar ice caps in Greenland? In Mexico, North Africa, Greece and Spain, people have long lived in whitewashed villages. White houses are cooler. Even though artificially created, this too produces the albedo effect. But most towns and cities are covered in asphalt and dark cement. This doesn't deflect the heat, but absorbs it. Cities actually create their own microclimates. Temperatures in built-up areas can be up to 6 degrees hotter than the surrounding countryside. So is there a way to turn big modern cities into sparkling Greek villages, at least in terms of reflectivity? Is this what the future will look like? Not just cities, but clothes, vehicles, even plants. We could genetically modify our crops and grasses to be lighter, engineered to reflect sunshine.
Even these simple measures could produce maybe half a watt per metre squared of cooling, which is about a third of the warming we've had from carbon dioxide. So it doesn't solve the problem for you, totally, but what it does is buy you some time.
If we're threatened with a kind of extreme future brought about by climatic tipping points, our only hope may be to adopt emergency cooling measures, like a white world. Measures that may well end up transforming our planet not by man-made warming, but by human design. This is where geoengineering comes in.
People have become increasingly interested in the possibility of engineering the Earth to compensate for the warming effects that we've been exerting on the climate. We do need to look at these options because it may well be that we fail to do enough in the more conventional approaches, and we need to resort to more extreme measures.
One of those extreme measures is called sulfur seeding. Sulfur seeding involves no less than waging war on the planet's atmosphere. It's an idea inspired by nature. When volcanoes have major eruptions, they spew out millions of tons of sulfate particles, creating an atmospheric sunscreen. These events have reduced global temperatures by more than ½ degree Celsius. It happened when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1991. If we could find a way of mimicking this, in effect creating a sulfur shield that wraps around the Earth, we could cool the planet.
Perhaps we could be getting the army to fire the sulfur up high into the atmosphere using their guns. As long as you keep putting it there, then you have this shield that reflects some of the sun's energy. And it also would give us very nice sunsets, but it might do some other things as well. We're all aware of the ozone depletion problem we had before when we inadvertently messed around with the chemistry of the stratosphere, where stratospheric ozone depletion. Now, we don't really know what would happen to the chemistry of the stratosphere, but we're worried that something would.
Various other extreme measures are being looked into. Such as ships that would spray mist into the air, creating more clouds. The most ambitious idea really does sound like science fiction. Millions of mirrors launched into orbit would reflect sunlight away from the Earth.
Now, if you put one mirror there, you'd need a mirror that's about 2,000 kilometers across. Or else the idea these days is perhaps put a lot of mirrors there, a lot of smaller ones, and you have little computers on board to keep them all facing in the right direction. It's an absolutely huge thing to contemplate. It would be so enormously expensive.
But we don't have to get to that stage. Solutions and technologies exist or are currently in development to halt and even reverse global warming. The tipping points and the outlandish measures with their staggering price tags don't have to be reached.
It is an emergency. We've reached a point where we need drastic actions very quickly if we're going to avoid disasters in the near term, but especially on the timescale of our children and grandchildren.
We can already see the outlines of the solution. We can see the outlines of what we need to do technologically, what we need to do economically, and what we need to do politically.
I have every reason to believe that there's some spark of sanity, of wisdom, of prudence in human personalities, as a result of which I think collectively we will be able to solve this problem.
Climate scientists estimate that if we have any chance of slowing down or halting global warming, then worldwide carbon emissions will have to peak by 2015. So it seems that the time to act is now. We have the power and the knowledge, so surely it's our responsibility to protect our planet for future generations.